On the morning of November 3rd, 1983, a man named Thomas Harlan walked into the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia, carrying something that would later be described by senior intelligence analysts as the most significant piece of physical evidence intercepted during the entire Cold War. Harlan was 37 years old, a case officer in the Directorate of Operations who specialized in Soviet counterintelligence, and the object he carried was an ordinary-looking leather briefcase, dark brown, slightly worn at the corners, with brass latches that clicked when opened. It weighed approximately 11 pounds. Inside were documents that would force the United States to confront how close the world had come to nuclear annihilation, not through deliberate aggression, but through catastrophic miscalculation born from mutual paranoia and systemic failures in communication that had been building for months. The briefcase had been acquired 48 hours earlier in West Berlin through an operation that began almost accidentally. A Soviet military attaché named Yuri Konstantinovich Belov, stationed at the Soviet embassy in East Berlin, had been under surveillance by the CIA Berlin station since June of that year. Belov was 42, a colonel in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and his movement suggested he was handling multiple agents across both sides of the divided city. CIA surveillance teams had documented over 30 meetings with suspected intelligence contacts between June and October, always in public places, always brief, never lasting more than 8 minutes. Belov was careful, professional, trained in the standard tradecraft that made identification of his network difficult. He varied his routes, checked for surveillance using reflections in shop windows, frequently doubled back through crowded streets, and maintained what appeared to be an entirely routine schedule when he was not conducting operational activity. On the afternoon of November 1st, 1983, Belov entered a bookstore on Kurfürstendamm in West Berlin, a location that CIA surveillance teams knew well because it sat near a checkpoint frequently used by Soviet personnel. The bookstore was 3 stories, filled with narrow aisles and dim lighting, the kind of place where someone could easily lose a tale or conduct a quick exchange without being observed. 2 CIA officers, stationed in a vehicle across the street, watched Belov enter at 2:47 in the afternoon. He remained inside for 23 minutes. When he exited, he was no longer carrying the briefcase he had brought with him. The surveillance team immediately radioed the information to their station chief, a man named Raymond Keller, who had been running Berlin operations since 1981. Keller made the decision to send someone inside. The officer who entered the bookstore was a woman named Lauren Mitchell, 31 years old, fluent in German, working under diplomatic cover at the American consulate. She had been with the agency for 6 years, most of that time spent in Eastern Europe, and she understood the risks of operating in a city where Soviet intelligence maintained an extensive network of watchers and informers. She walked into the bookstore at 3:18, browsing the shelves casually, moving slowly through the aisles as if searching for something specific. She found the briefcase on the 3rd floor, tucked behind a stack of old magazines in a corner that received almost no foot traffic. It was a classic dead drop, left in a location where a handler or asset could retrieve it later without ever making direct contact with Belov. Mitchell did not touch the briefcase immediately. She spent another 12 minutes in the store, establishing her presence as that of an ordinary customer, purchasing 2 books at the counter before returning to the 3rd floor. When she was certain no one was watching, she picked up the briefcase, carried it down the stairs concealed inside a larger shopping bag, and walked out. The entire operation took 39 minutes. By 4:30 that afternoon, the briefcase was in a secure room at the CIA Berlin station, and by 6 o'clock, Keller had contacted Langley with a preliminary report of what they had found inside. The contents of the briefcase were photographed, catalogued, and transmitted via encrypted channels to CIA headquarters, over the next 8 hours. What arrived at Langley early on November 2nd caused immediate alarm among the analysts in the Soviet division. The briefcase contained 43 pages of typed documents, all in Russian, all marked with classification stamps indicating they originated from within the Soviet Ministry of Defense. The documents were not intelligence reports in the traditional sense. They were operational directives, internal memos, assessment reports, and communications logs that had been compiled over a 3-week period beginning in mid-October. What made them extraordinary was the context they provided about Soviet military thinking during a period that American intelligence had been monitoring with growing concern. For months, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had been escalating to levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. In September, Soviet air defense forces had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747 that had strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including a United States congressman. President Ronald Reagan had condemned the act as a massacre, and relations between Washington and Moscow had deteriorated rapidly. The Soviet leadership under General Secretary Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chairman known for his deep suspicion of American intentions, had become increasingly convinced that the United States was preparing for a first-strike nuclear attack. This belief was not irrational paranoia but the product of a coordinated Soviet intelligence operation called Ryan, an acronym in Russian for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, which translates to nuclear missile attack. Ryan had been initiated in 1981 by Andropov himself when he was still head of the KGB. The operation directed Soviet intelligence officers around the world to watch for signs that the United States and its NATO allies were preparing for a surprise nuclear strike. These signs included increased activity at military bases, unusual patterns in communications traffic, stockpiling of blood supplies at hospitals, and any indication that Western leaders were preparing to evacuate from capital cities. The problem with Ryan was that it created a feedback loop. Soviet intelligence officers, under pressure to provide evidence supporting the leadership's fears, began reporting routine military activities as potential indicators of imminent attack. This information was then analyzed in Moscow by officials who were already predisposed to believe the worst about American intentions, which reinforced the belief that a first strike was being planned, which in turn led to demands for more intelligence, which produced more alarming reports. By the fall of 1983, this cycle had reached a dangerous peak. The Soviet military was conducting a series of war games and exercises that simulated responses to a NATO nuclear attack. At the same time, NATO was preparing for its own exercise, called Able Archer 83, scheduled to begin on November 7th. Able Archer was an annual command post exercise designed to test NATO's nuclear release procedures. In previous years, it had been a routine event, largely bureaucratic, involving the movement of messages and the rehearsal of protocols. But in 1983, changes had been made to the exercise that would prove fateful. For the first time, the exercise would simulate the actual release of nuclear weapons, with participants moving through the alert levels that would precede a real nuclear strike. For the first time, new encrypted communication systems would be used. And for the first time, senior officials who would normally not participate, including those in the chain of command for nuclear authorization, were scheduled to take part. To Soviet intelligence, these changes looked like preparation for an actual attack disguised as an exercise. The documents in Belov's briefcase made this clear. One memo, dated October 20th, came from a senior officer in the GRU's analytical division and was addressed to the Soviet General Staff. It summarized intelligence gathered over the previous month and concluded that NATO's upcoming exercise showed characteristics consistent with preparations for a real military operation. The memo cited the participation of high-level officials, the use of new communication systems, and the timing of the exercise, which coincided with a period of heightened political tension following the Korean Airlines shoot-down. The memo's conclusion was stark. It stated that while the exercise might be routine, Soviet forces should prepare for the possibility that it could transition into an actual attack. Another document was an operational order dated October 26th, issued to Soviet nuclear forces in Eastern Europe. It directed commanders to bring their units to a higher state of readiness in anticipation of the NATO exercise. Specific instructions were provided for the arming of nuclear-capable aircraft, the dispersal of mobile missile units, and the establishment of emergency command posts. The order did not call for the launching of weapons, but it placed Soviet forces in a posture where they could execute a nuclear strike within minutes if the order were given. The implications were chilling. If NATO proceeded with Able Archer 83 as planned, and if Soviet forces were already on heightened alert, any miscommunication, any technical error, any misinterpreted action by either side could trigger a sequence of events that would be impossible to stop. The most alarming document in the briefcase was a communication log showing messages exchanged between Soviet military intelligence and forward-deployed units during the last week of October. One entry, dated October 28th, reported that a GRU officer stationed near a NATO airbase in West Germany had observed unusual activity involving nuclear-capable aircraft. The officer reported that the aircraft were being loaded with what appeared to be training ordnance, but noted that the activity was occurring at an unusual hour and involved more aircraft than normal. The report was flagged as significant and forwarded to Moscow with a notation that it might indicate preparation for a preemptive strike. Another entry from October 30th described increased radio traffic among American military units in West Germany, which Soviet signals intelligence interpreted as evidence of heightened operational tempo. A third entry noted that blood banks near American military installations in Europe had increased their stockpiles, a development that Soviet analysts believed could indicate preparation for casualties from combat operations. What made these reports so dangerous was that they were based on routine activities that had been filtered through the lens of Ryan's assumptions. The aircraft loading that was reported on October 28th was part of a scheduled training exercise. The increased radio traffic on October 30th was related to maintenance issues affecting a communications network. The blood bank stockpiles were part of a normal resupply cycle that occurred quarterly. But to Soviet analysts operating under the framework of Ryan, these mundane explanations were dismissed as cover stories. Every piece of information was interpreted as confirmation that an attack was being prepared. Thomas Harlan flew from Berlin to Washington on November 2nd with the briefcase and its contents. He arrived at Dulles International Airport at 6:20 in the morning local time and drove directly to Langley. By 8 o'clock, he was sitting in a conference room with a group that included the Deputy Director for Operations, the Chief of the Soviet Division, and 3 senior analysts who specialized in Soviet military doctrine. Harlan walked them through each document, explaining where it had been found, what it revealed, and why he believed it represented an intelligence windfall of extraordinary importance. The briefcase, he explained, was not just a collection of classified papers. It was a window into Soviet thinking at a moment when that thinking was dangerously distorted by fear and misperception. The analysts spent the next 6 hours reviewing the documents in detail. They cross-referenced dates and events mentioned in the Soviet memos with American intelligence reports to verify authenticity. They examined the language and terminology used in the documents to confirm they were consistent with known Soviet military communication styles. They analyzed the classification markings to determine the level of access that would have been required to compile such a collection. By mid-afternoon, the consensus was clear. The documents were genuine, and the picture they painted was terrifying. The Soviet Union, operating under the belief that the United States was preparing for a nuclear-first strike, had placed its forces on alert in anticipation of NATO's Able Archer exercise. If the exercise proceeded as planned, there was a significant risk that the Soviets would interpret it as the opening phase of an actual attack. In that scenario, Soviet commanders might make the decision to launch their own preemptive strike rather than wait to absorb a first blow. The margin for error was razor-thin. One miscommunication, one sensor malfunction, one misinterpreted radar signal could set in motion a sequence that would end in nuclear war. That evening, November 2nd, a secure message was transmitted from CIA headquarters to the National Security Council. It was marked with the highest classification level and hand-delivered by courier to National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane at the White House. The message summarized the contents of the briefcase and provided an assessment that characterized the current situation as the most dangerous moment in United States-Soviet relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The message recommended immediate action to prevent a catastrophic miscalculation. It proposed that senior American officials reach out to their Soviet counterparts through diplomatic channels to provide reassurance that Able Archer 83 was purely an exercise. It also recommended that changes be made to the exercise itself to reduce activities that might be misinterpreted as preparation for an actual strike. McFarlane read the message twice. He had been briefed on Ryan earlier in the year through intelligence provided by Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer working for British intelligence who had reported that Soviet leadership was genuinely fearful of an American attack. But the documents from Belov's briefcase provided confirmation that this fear was not limited to paranoid officials in the KGB. It had permeated the Soviet military command structure and was driving operational decisions that brought both sides closer to the nuclear threshold. McFarlane scheduled an emergency meeting with President Reagan for the following morning. The meeting took place in the Oval Office at 9:30 on November 3rd. McFarlane was joined by Secretary of State George Shultz, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, and CIA Director William Casey. Reagan listened as McFarlane summarized the contents of the briefcase and explained the assessment that had been prepared by the intelligence community. The president, who had spent much of his first term taking a hard line against the Soviet Union, was visibly shaken by what he heard. According to notes taken during the meeting, Reagan asked whether the Soviets truly believed that the United States would launch a surprise nuclear attack. When told that the evidence suggested they did, Reagan asked what could be done to change their perception. Shultz recommended opening a direct communication channel with Soviet leadership to explain that Able Archer was not a cover for military action. Weinberger argued that changing the exercise would send a signal of weakness and might embolden Soviet aggression in other areas. Casey suggested that the intelligence community increase its monitoring of Soviet military activities during the exercise to provide early warning if the situation deteriorated. Reagan listened to each position and then made his decision. The United States would proceed with Able Archer as planned, but with modifications designed to reduce the risk of misinterpretation. Senior officials who had been scheduled to participate would withdraw. The simulated nuclear release procedures would be simplified, and American military units in Europe would be instructed to avoid any activities that could be perceived as preparation for combat operations. In addition, Reagan directed that a message be delivered to the Soviet leadership through diplomatic channels. The message, transmitted through the American ambassador in Moscow on November 4th, stated that the United States had no intention of initiating hostilities and that Able Archer 83 was a routine training exercise. The message emphasized that both sides had a responsibility to avoid actions that could lead to miscalculation and proposed a meeting between senior officials to discuss ways to improve communication and reduce tensions. The Soviet response received on November 6th was cool but not hostile. It acknowledged the American message and expressed agreement that preventing miscalculation was important. It did not, however, admit that Soviet forces had been placed on alert or that Soviet leadership had been concerned about Able Archer. The exercise began as scheduled on November 7th and concluded on November 11th without incident. NATO forces executed their planned activities. Soviet forces remained on heightened alert but did not take any actions that would have indicated preparation for an imminent strike. American intelligence monitored the situation closely throughout the 5-day period, watching for any sign that the Soviets were escalating their posture. None came. By the time the exercise ended, the immediate crisis had passed, but the documents in Belov's briefcase had revealed something that American policymakers could no longer ignore. The Soviet Union's fear of an American first strike was real, deeply rooted, and driving decisions that brought both sides dangerously close to a conflict that neither wanted. The aftermath of the crisis led to a fundamental reassessment of American policy toward the Soviet Union. Reagan, who had come into office with a confrontational approach to Moscow, began to moderate his rhetoric. In his diary entry for November 11th, he wrote that he had been shocked to learn how frightened Soviet leaders were of American intentions. He noted that if they truly believed the United States was preparing for an attack, then actions intended to demonstrate strength might instead be perceived as preparation for war. Over the following months, Reagan would begin a series of initiatives designed to improve communication with the Soviet Union and reduce the risk of miscalculation. These included the establishment of direct channels for crisis communication, agreements on confidence-building measures, and eventually the resumption of arms control negotiations that had stalled earlier in his presidency. The briefcase itself became the subject of intense analysis within the intelligence community. Efforts were made to determine how Belov had obtained such a comprehensive collection of classified documents. The most likely explanation was that he had access to multiple sources within the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus, possibly including officers who were concerned about the direction Soviet policy was taking and wanted to provide information that might prevent a catastrophic error. There was also speculation that Belov himself might have been deliberately leaving the briefcase in a location where it would be found, as a way of communicating information he could not transmit through normal intelligence channels. This theory was never confirmed, but it gained support from the fact that Belov made no apparent effort to retrieve the briefcase after leaving it in the bookstore, and he was not observed returning to the location in the days that followed. Belov remained in Berlin until December, when he was rotated back to Moscow as part of a routine personnel change. He continued his career in the GRU and eventually reached the rank of Major General before retiring in 1991. There is no evidence that he ever faced consequences for the loss of the briefcase, which suggests either that Soviet authorities never learned about it or that they chose not to pursue the matter. In later years, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, some former Soviet officials would acknowledge that the fall of 1983 had been a period of acute tension, though none would confirm that Soviet forces had been on alert in response to Able Archer. Belov himself never spoke publicly about his role in the events of that November, and he died in 2006 without leaving any memoir or statement that might clarify his actions. Thomas Harlan continued working for the CIA until his retirement in 2003. He spent most of the 1990s in Eastern Europe, managing operations in the post-Soviet states as they transitioned from communist control. In interviews conducted years after the Cold War ended, he described the recovery of Belov's briefcase as the most significant operation of his career, not because of the intelligence value of the documents themselves, but because of what they revealed about how close the world had come to disaster. He noted that in the years following 1983, both American and Soviet officials had taken steps to reduce the risk of miscalculation, including the establishment of nuclear risk reduction centers and the negotiation of treaties that improved transparency and communication. These measures, he believed, were directly influenced by the recognition that the assumptions each side made about the other could be dangerously wrong. The story of the briefcase remained classified for over 2 decades. It was not until 2007, following the declassification of documents related to Cold War intelligence operations, that details about the incident began to emerge in academic studies and historical accounts. Even then, many aspects of the operation remained obscure. The identity of the CIA officers involved was protected, the specific contents of some documents were redacted, and the full scope of Soviet military preparations during Able Archer remained the subject of debate among historians and former intelligence officials. What is clear from the available evidence is that November 1983 represented a turning point. The combination of Soviet fear, American pressure, and systemic failures in communication had created a situation where nuclear war could have begun not through deliberate decision, but through catastrophic misunderstanding. The briefcase, with its collection of Soviet documents, provided the evidence that forced American policymakers to confront this reality. It revealed that the Cold War, which had been characterized by deterrence based on mutual understanding of the consequences of nuclear conflict, had in fact been sustained by a fragile equilibrium that could be shattered by misperception and fear. The modifications made to Able Archer, the diplomatic messages sent to Moscow, and the subsequent changes in American policy all stemmed from the intelligence provided by that worn leather briefcase. Without it, NATO's exercise would have proceeded as originally planned, with senior officials participating and full simulation of nuclear release procedures. Soviet forces, already on alert and operating under the assumption that an attack was imminent, might have interpreted these activities as confirmation of their worst fears. The sequence of events that would have followed is impossible to predict with certainty, but the potential for escalation was undeniable. In the years that followed, historians and analysts would debate whether Able Archer, 83, truly brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, or whether the danger had been overstated. Some argued that Soviet leadership would never have authorized a first strike based solely on an exercise, no matter how realistic it appeared. Others pointed to the documents in Belov's briefcase as evidence that Soviet military commanders had been prepared to act if they believed an attack was underway, and that the decision might have been made by officers in the field rather than by political leaders in Moscow. What cannot be disputed is that both sides believed they were operating in a moment of extreme danger, and that actions taken during this period had the potential to trigger consequences that neither side intended. The briefcase, that ordinary object made extraordinary by its contents, serves as a reminder of how nuclear deterrence functioned during the Cold War. It was not a system based on perfect information and rational calculation. It was a system that operated in conditions of uncertainty, fear, and incomplete understanding, where decisions of existential importance had to be made quickly, often with inadequate information and under enormous pressure. The fact that the system did not fail, that nuclear war was avoided despite multiple close calls throughout the Cold War, was not the result of superior strategy or inevitable logic. It was the product of luck, individual judgment, and moments when the right information reached the right people at the right time. Thomas Harlan carried that briefcase into CIA headquarters on November 3, 1983, believing he had recovered valuable intelligence that would help the United States understand Soviet military thinking. He was correct, but the value of what he carried went beyond intelligence. It provided the evidence that prevented a catastrophe, and in doing so it demonstrated that sometimes the most important battles of the Cold War were not fought with weapons or strategy, but with information, understanding, and the willingness to recognize when assumptions about an adversary were dangerously wrong. The world did not end in November 1983, but it came closer than most people would ever know, and the margin between survival and disaster was measured not in miles or megatons, but in the contents of a briefcase found in a bookstore in Berlin.